A touch of Habermas. I'd like to begin with the current philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, regarding what he has to say about communicative rationality and the public sphere. Habermas locates a fundamental human interest. This interest that human beings have is a deeply seated interest in communicating with one another, for everything regarding any kind of social bonding. Therefore, Habermas's concern with undistorted and clear communication has a lot to offer, in particular, in understanding what he calls systematically distorted communication. Jürgen Habermas looked into traditional disciplines throughout the history of Western and European societies and civilizations that dealt with not so much with problems related to monological communication, that is, in the area of labor and the economy and that of instrumental reason of the sciences, but more in the area of communication having to do with the humanities, which is supposed to enlighten us about our dialogue with one another. For Jürgen Habermas, we really form ourselves in both dimensions, but we could not possibly become subjective selves without the communicative dimension of dialogue. For him, we can only become selves in our interaction with other selves. It's by seeing how other people respond to the things we say that we learn more about who we are. This may seem obvious, but it's not that obvious in philosophy. The controversial part within the works of Habermas is from his claim that the human race has a third interest, and that's the critical interest in emancipation. This freedom the human race desires is fundamental and so important that we need it in order to survive, to free ourselves from both the distortions of instrumental reason and the distortions of what could be called communicative reason. If we are to free ourselves from the distortions for the human race to survive, we need to learn to labor more humanely, and just as importantly, we need to be able to communicate with one another freely and clearly. Without doing so, our chances of a long survival are not great. The base of his communication model has what could be called hermeneutics, hermeneutic, meaning interpretative. A more in-depth definition of hermeneutics is the social subjectivist paradigm, where meaning is intersubjectively created and focuses on defining shared linguistic meaning for representations and/or symbols, in contrast to the empirical universe of assumed scientific realism. Therefore, it's not enough for Habermas to have this field of instrumental reason within science and technology with its advances. He is more interested in the field of interpretation where humanity advances itself through conversation in an ethical and aesthetic way. This third human interest is crucial to his argument, as it is a fundamental interest in human liberation, a liberation from unnecessary constraints on our freedom, and into our full development. The model Habermas uses to describe our distorted communication, as was previously mentioned, is systematically distorted communication. Habermas identified that in every age, the ruling ideas were the ideas of the ruling classes. This is a truism, not a theory. Any fair reading of philosophy will feature this. There are flat-out statements made that cut off any debates, while debates are the only way to achieve a clear understanding that would lead to the best outcome. Furthermore, debating passes the famous test of ideology. That's when you ask yourself if what you believe is in the interest of other people, and not just yourself, opposed to a belief that you suspect may be what the very powerful would want you to believe. If you notice that all of your ideas come from the people who control the means and the dissemination of information and communication, you would be justified in rethinking some of those ideas. As an example showing where systematically distorted communication is overcome, Habermas describes Freud's practice of removing symptoms. In the situation between an analyst and a patient, it is not just a simple case of the patient talking through their problems, to then have the analyst offer an interpretation and diagnosis. Freud succeeded to a certain extent in developing a practice that did remove blocks to communication. He listened to his patient, and the only way he could bring his analysis to a conclusion is when he intervenes and presents a possible interpretation, but it will not work until the patient has that striking moment, a flash of insight, as all the pieces fall into place. Here, the patient and the therapist, through clear communication, made progress. In the late 20th century, after what looked like the destruction of reason itself, in a society of subjects that have become robotic humanoids, Jürgen Habermas tried to defend human reason by offering a model for undistorted communication that could serve as a base concept for what he calls communicative rationality. The purpose for this is to untangle the entwinement between enlightened thought and barbaric action that we've seen since the history of modernity. We've seen people making individually monological instrumental decisions based on instrumental reason. That led us into horrible paradoxes, but for Habermas, the trick is not to give up on modern life. It's not to fall beneath the level of civilization reached so far. The trick is to disentangle enlightenment from terror and barbarism, because we haven't succeeded in doing this so far, as yet. Fascism was profound proof that the Enlightenment, with its technology, had not led to the liberation of human beings as the great philosophers of the Enlightenment thought it would. The 19th century believed in progress, but as the philosopher Theodore Adorno once cynically remarked, there is no history that leads from slavery to freedom, but there is a history that leads from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. So Habermas wants to find a way to disentangle the more distorting barbaric aspects of the Enlightenment from those that we clearly want to hang on to. In Habermas's opinion, there have been advances in modern life. Not everything that modernity has produced has been a disaster. The trick then is to not throw out the baby with the bathwater and throw away the advances of modernity when we are in the process of trying to clear up this distorted communication within people's ways of life. Habermas holds that the sentences we utter, even from an early age, have built into them the desire for consensus and mutual understanding. Whether you consciously bring it to mind or not, when you speak a sentence, it has built into it the desire that you be understood by others, a need that you communicate with another person even if they're from a different class, or a different race, a different ethnic group, or a different gender. As a sentence has as one of its preconditions the desire for unconstrained understanding, Habermas begins to lay out a series of conditions for such communication, and one is the equality provision. Undistorted communication would have a symmetry condition. Truly undistorted communication would have a balanced condition that enables everyone an equal opportunity to talk and to listen. This is more politically interesting than it sounds. It not only means that everyone has an equal right to the action of speech, it also means that everyone has an equal right to question and an equal right to an answer. Habermas believes that we couldn't have undistorted communication without this symmetry condition. For example, a teacher may know that it's an important condition, but it's impossible to achieve in a classroom under these current social conditions, because a teacher has the power to grade a student and give him an F, for example, may keep him out of law school. Therefore, as a teacher has that power, you can't expect that student and teacher to communicate in an undistorted way, because the communication is distorted by the teacher's power to judge what the student says. This is also why the people who run big operations, that of big business, seldom get the undistorted truth about their situation. Furthermore, there can't be truly undistorted communication in the different relationships within a family, between husbands and their wives, their sons and their daughters, because when you're in a relative position of power, the other person is aware of it too, and therefore of their role, so you cannot expect undistorted communication here, not just in a personal sense, but systematically distorted by the relation of unequal power. If you're to have a rational communicative situation, everyone must have the same right to speak, and the same right to be heard. Regarding this equality provision of power, the only force that is acceptable is the force that Habermas says is the force a free human being can ever recognize, and that is that peculiar, unique, unforced force of the better argument. Habermas believes that if true rationality at face value is to be practiced, we can change our minds if we hear a better argument without feeling ashamed. If you're in a free and equal situation of communication, and someone convinces you through a better argument, it would be considered wise to let go of your outdated ideas, to now think differently. There is no wisdom to be had through distorted communication, but there would be wisdom through an unforced force that a person feels when they are able to come to their own conclusion freely. Other conditions Habermas adds to how we can talk to achieve undistorted communication and experience the ideal speech situation is 1. While we do occasionally lie, it belongs to the structure Habermas is explaining, that when we contribute to a discussion on a topic about what's in the world, what entities there are, and how they behave, that we try to make our contribution to the conversation one that is true as possible, and definitely not intentionally distorted. This is an obvious piece of good advice. 2. We should try to stay relevant to the subject, which in turn saves mental energy, by avoiding confusion. And 3. Make your contribution sincerely. Habermas's view of the self is a thoroughly social being that interacts with the natural world, the social world, and the inner world, with a subjective relationship between these three dimensions, then shared with other selves. It becomes an intersubjective experience that leads to a better understanding, not only between other selves, but a better understanding of the self, to the self, in itself. Instead of a materialistic society operating like a giant factory, Habermas views society as a giant seminar room. Everybody in a seminar should be relevant, concise, sincere, and make their contributions true. A touch of Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse identified the crisis that was always at the heart of modern life after capitalism, rationalization, and bureaucratization had flourished. Traditional intellectuals used the familiar phrase, the Enlightenment, for the rise of the modern world, with its main goal to free the human mind from superstition, dogma, and any attachment to such prejudice. In response to the question, what is the Enlightenment? Kant said, dare to use your own reason, and have the audacity to reason for yourself, instead of listening to the church fathers of religion. The Enlightenment is known, of course, as the motivation behind the growth and the power of science, which leads science to fuel technology and information systems. The crisis that was always in the heart of the Enlightenment was also its goal. That is its idea in making the attempt to demystify the world. This attempt to make the world transparent through its type of reason carried with it a strange dark side. The more we cleared the fields of the traditional spiritual views, the more we became convinced that science was the answer. The term Marcuse uses for that is instrumental reason. That is, reason used as an instrument for changing the understanding of nature and human beings, and by claiming to demystify the world of religious fear-based dogma, we gain a better truthful understanding of it. Yet, the more the Enlightenment progressed, it simply turned out not to be the case that we became less afraid in the face of the unknown. Now the unknown appeared more terrifying than ever, and it wasn't the case that we became less dogmatic. As a matter of fact, the sciences have now branched out into so many areas that the only way anyone could believe in any of them is dogmatically, since none of us could study them, because we don't have enough time. So in a paradoxical way, the Enlightenment built up the intellect enough to see through mystification, but by developing an intellect hard enough to see through these mystifications, an intellect that powerful has a tendency to become totalitarian. The Enlightenment has bewildered the masses, in such a way that it causes us to yield before the overpowering forces of technology, in a more contemptible surrender than any that was ever called for in religion. To just surrender before the powers of technology, as we do in the modern current state of the world, is a serious and dangerous form of ignorance of the powers of technology. They far surpass the characteristics that we associate with God. In the Bible, the book of Revelations, the apocalypse is a magnificent myth, but long ago in our society became a reality, a technologically achievable reality. We no longer had to conjure up 10-headed beasts with wings to be afraid of. Now we have systems, rational instrumental systems to contend with. What was a myth has become a reality. This leads to a further paradox Marcuse locates in modern rationality, and that is, instrumental rationality, that can be associated with atomic bits of information as opposed to real knowledge. It's an array of instrumental singular decisions based upon parts, and the outcome isn't rational, the outcome is irrational and dangerous. As an example, we finish work for the day, so it's time to go home. It's rational to want to go home after work, so each individual takes to their car, gets on the freeway, and what is the outcome? The outcome is that everybody's sitting on the freeway in bumper-to-bumper traffic. The outcome is irrational, because the outcome is not looked at as the whole, the big picture is missing. There is no reason because the Enlightenment's reason focuses upon individuals' parts with no context, therefore unable to see the overall outcome. Another example is the stock market crash, the first stock market crash in the history of the world in which human beings didn't make the foul-ups. Because humans can't make decisions fast enough to buy and sell on the stock exchange, computers were thought to be superior as they are geared to make rational decisions a lot faster. As a result, the stock market crashed because of the computers making individual rational decisions based on their little bit of information. It would have crashed further except that we still are able to unplug them. How much longer will they give us that privilege? I think it's reasonable, if not very certain, to speculate what may happen when the decision will work the other way, when they will say, "To heck with you, I will unplug you." We need an answer to this question. Why did the Enlightenment, which began with the love of human reason with its use to demystify things, how did it itself become a force of mystification? It debunked religion, but it engaged in overkill. By debunking religion in the way in which it did, it left us open with the claim that science has nothing to do with whole fields of human experience, therefore, are now just given over to the wildest kind of insane, worse still, inhumane theories. This type of reason pays no attention and gives no guidance. Why are there things outside of instrumental reason that are ignored? The Self Under Siege is what Rick Roderick has called this series of lectures, and it's an appropriate title indeed. The Self Under Siege can never find meaning in this bare form of thinking, if living, for all that you're up to, is making rational decisions one after another. That's not a rich enough notion of experience for human life. It is not that Marcuse is saying that our society should throw away instrumental reason and should just give up on thinking scientifically. What he wants to say is that if we don't find a more balanced approach to ourselves, the world, and other people, but only depend on instrumental rationality, then we are lost. If you wanted to break it down into so-called worlds, you'd start with the inner world. That inner space of the self develops, but has the potential to give rise to a pathological inner self, through its contact with what you might call modern life. The beginning signs of pathology are anxiety, a feeling of hopelessness, nausea, dread and despair. These inner structures now have a massive psychology industry to deal with this, and then we of course have a society that is massively soaked in drugs, pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical, cigarettes and alcohol. In the so-called social world, A world based purely on economic bottom lines, the problem is alienation, the sense of feeling separation that is not just a mere mood, it's a structure, it's a separation from your object that you're producing, from the lack of control over the process of making that product, and a lack of meaning for making it, which separates you from other human beings that come along to buy the product. Alienation is the way of the relationship between work and money, as it tends to separate human beings from each other. A touch of Foucault. Michel Foucault thinks of the history within Western civilization as a continuous narrative about progress. Foucault prefers the terms archaeology and genealogies instead of the word history to make the distinction between the method they use. The genealogical method could be looked at like a reversal of perspectives. This reversal of perspective is where you don't only read history from the standpoint of the rulers, but from the standpoint of the masses. To look at our past using the reversal of perspective as a method, you take note of what is left out of the official histories, and use that as your clue to discover a truer picture. The reversal perspective is a method that brings to light the marginal views, instead of only paying attention to what the leader said, or whatever the dominant group said. Looking for the marginal discourse achieves two things. It makes it clear that a marginal discourse existed, and it also shows a bigger picture, because you now have the two sides of the story. Foucault identified that knowledge is controlled in every society through mechanisms of power. Anywhere you find knowledge you will find power, they are linked, and are conditions for the possibility of one another. As Foucault puts it, knowledge is a regime of power. Today, information would be the word to replace knowledge, given that's what the university systems and other systems produce, information, not knowledge. What cuts deeply against a lot of our humanistic sentiments is that we would like to believe that knowledge is what can be accepted by all rational beings, but what Foucault points to is the structure within which we learn these systems. Foucault is concerned with our whole genealogical slices of time, within which we learn certain practices, and how to obey them. As an example, Roderick mentions that when students argue this point, he threatens to give them a C, and then they stop arguing. This thesis, as one could predict, has outraged a whole group of people at universities. It has caused a rage, a real disturbance. It's as though someone has given away the secret. As another example, a graduate student in physics that teachers take a particular dislike to, and who comes up with equations and views about Newtonian dynamics that are at odds with various more contemporary views, we can call him old-fashioned, and exercise the power to kick him out, or if the reverse is the case, we can say, he's a kook, and his work is too flighty and too bizarre, and again have the power to kick him out. Clearly there's a relation between knowledge and power. It is a mechanism that has operated in every society. The issue is, knowledge is comprised of not only institutions and institutional rules, but of discourse as well. This is where we can see Habermas's work as important by how relating to communication, knowledge, or information is comprised of distorted discourses. Institutional rules for communication functions through rules of exclusion, rather than inclusion. The rules of institutional communications function through rules that determine who may speak, what they may speak about, for how long they may speak, and in what setting they may speak. This is not a prejudiced view. All societies have had this. To see these rules of exclusion at work, we have theorists like Richard Rorty describing philosophy as the conversation of mankind. Well, that's very nice, except certain people didn't get to talk in the history of Western civilization. They were excluded from the conversation. In his book Madness and Civilization, Foucault pointed out the long history of how the discourse of reason had excluded from it the mad. This changes in the medieval period where the mad are considered in Shakespeare's plays as the fool, The mad appear as the people who bring the most important wisdom into the place. The mad in Greek society were considered as touched by the gods, and their words were looked at almost as the words of oracles. But with the increasing rationalization of the world, the mad began to be shut away in asylums. At first this was a brutal process, but later became humanized. Humanize is a word Foucault doesn't like. In fact, he doesn't like humanism, or the talk about humans, as he's afraid every time he hears it. It is not a word of inclusion, but of exclusion based on the history of the use of that word. The great reformers of madness, the ones who wanted to cure them, created what Foucault calls a whole new disciplinary matrix around madness, but what that means is that the curing of them did not liberate them. It did not give them the value that they had at one time. Instead, it set up a whole series of processes within which they could be observed, drugged, analyzed and reanalyzed, and of course, when we look at the expansion of this therapeutic industry on into the late 20th century, we now find out that very few of us don't belong in it. Who would have guessed that the discourse of madness would eventually cover the whole social field, and until what perhaps is the last growth industry we have, other than making movies about sex and violence, is psychiatry and 12-step programs. This is a growth industry where you can now retrain yourself in midlife, since you don't need a degree to do this, and set up your own 12-step program. So for Foucault, this is not some great new humanistic advance in medicine that has liberalized the treatment of madness. It is a new form of control that's based on a new language about the mad. For example, we no longer call them morons and idiots, we call them the differently abled. But for Foucault, this new discourse is even more totalitarian, because behind it hides the same mechanisms of power which keep these people in their sway. One of the greatest examples of this is the discourse concerning body weight in women, with bulimia and anorexia. It's as though our male-dominant society was able in the Middle Ages to put a chastity belt on a woman, to keep food away from her and starve if she misbehaved. But today we accomplished the same feat through images that are constantly bombarded into the conscious, into the unconscious of women, and they perform the wonderfully humanistic task of starving themselves to death, while male therapists teach them how to get on 12-step programs to eat. For Foucault, this is why it's not humanism. This kind of malady is a cultural malady that strikes at the very heart of life. Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find ourselves worth being, the stakes are simply life itself. In closing, I would like to mention that the most current philosophical attempts to understand both the self, society and our place in it, have been what I will call deflationary. I'll use for an example, an article by the philosopher Richard Roderick called, "The World Well Lost." This is the upshoot, the final outcome of a tradition that's at least 2,500 years old, and it's a tradition produced in tiny little articles, 4 or 5-page articles, in journals that are read by a number of people that's small enough, that if they were all in a small boat that sank, would have no readership. After Rorty wrote this article, it developed a principle that I think has become widespread toward the end of the 20th century concerning philosophy's role in informing us about ourselves, or about the world. The title itself, "The World Well Lost," indicates Rorty's view that any problem that's been around for the last 2,500 years, and for which we still don't have a solution, the response by this contemporary philosopher is, "I don't care." The work of intellectuals has always been separate from the work of ordinary people. In other words, you have to be freed from the constraints of manual labor. If you are involved in manual labor, you won't really have the time to do intellectual work. That separation, That faithful separation between intellectual and manual labor has been with philosophy throughout. It's rather disappointing, though, to have that tradition, the great tradition of thinking in general, be reduced to a comment like, well, gee, I don't care, we haven't figured it out. Similarly, let me give you one more example of the profound results of recent contemporary analytic philosophy. The most widely accepted theory of truth is Tarski's theory of truth. I won't do it justice here, but I will give you an account that fairly summarizes its main insight. Tarski's theory of truth goes something like this. The sentence, "Snow is white," is true, if, and only if, snow is white. I don't expect anybody in the audience to gasp if you follow me. This isn't a theory of truth. This is the deflationary remark about how we use the word truth. This is not the outcome of what we thought were the glowing and humanistic accounts that I appreciate to this day, developed by Socrates, Aristotle, all the way through to Aquinas, and in the late 20th century. What we get in area after area are these what I will call deflationary accounts. On the upside, these accounts don't pretend to know much. In other words, they're not overly grand. It may turn out these deflationary things are all we do know, that snow is white, if, and only if it's white, and that if we can't tell whether we're free, or determined after 2,000 years, so then the best attitude to take is, I don't really give a damn. I mean, if that turns out to be the right view, we'll leave ourselves with that, but there are some problems, and that is about how a deflationary view is hard to take, and one is, our view of ourselves as selves, our own self-reflective view about what we are as human beings, what is our place in our society, in our world, and more importantly, what are our commitments, our stations in life, our roles as husbands, wives, fathers and mothers and significant others. It's extremely deflationary to think, oh yes, the self, I haven't got one. I mean, that's disappointing. And I'd like to argue in a strong sense that every one of us has some kind of theory of what we are as a person. By that I don't mean a really highly developed theory like one in quantum mechanics or anything like that. I only mean a narrative story, something that attempts to connect the various disconnected episodes in our lives, something that gives us a reason to think we're the same person today that we were yesterday in some important way. In short, that in some way we want to have a narrative about our lives, a narrative that means something. This new phrase, the politics of meaning, which I'm afraid is going to be just a part of pop psychology, but it may in fact have political implications. By that I mean that people can have refrigerators, nice cars, nice homes, nice children and nice degrees, nice friends, but have absolutely no sense of who the hell they are, and be in utter despair. The self under siege is a structural condition, and whether philosophy is the right discipline to look at this problem or not is unimportant to me, because in looking at it myself, I've been guided more by this problem than by the discipline that I started out working in. Regarding a college curriculum and seeing how it's divided, and we've got curriculum committees that review them once a week, or once a month and then once a year, I don't care who talks about it. I just care that it's part of the ongoing conversation of our species about itself, about who we are. This seems to me to be very important. It's an utterly crucially important topic in my view. The self under siege comes across in part with apocalyptic tones, because I really do believe that new factors, new social factors and others in the late 20th century have led to a kind of pressure on human beings, on selves, not only as individuals, but on them anonymously.